right. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. Whether you're a seasoned genealogist or just starting to build your family tree, you've likely encountered a census record, or maybe even relied on one to break through a brick wall. But what exactly are we looking at when we open those faded schedules and long list of names? So what we're going to be looking at is the Canadian census, one of the most powerful tools in our genealogical toolkit. Think of it as a time machine. Every 10 years, Canada captured a moment in the lives of its people, where they lived, who they lived with, and what they did for a living, where they came from, and often how they were adapting to a changing world. From 1851 to 1931, each census tells a different story. The early ones help us trace pioneers and early settlers. The later ones show us how families grew, moved, and changed, though through war, immigration, economic hardship, and opportunity. In this session, we'll walk through each census release, highlight what questions were asked, and uncover how to use those details to bring our ancestors' lives into sharper focus. We're also going to be talking about where to find these records, how to interpret them, and what to do when the data seems, well, a little off. So why does the census matter? Census records are snapshots of families at a moment in time. It really is a photograph. Then we reveal relationships and ages and occupations and more. We track migrations and economic status and family growth. Now here's an overview of the Canadian census. We have Canada East and West starting in 1851. That's the very first time that we have that detail. Because before that, we have census in Canada in 1825. Even in Quebec, as far back as 1666 was the very first one that was taken. And then we gradually go through a broader coverage. 1871 marks that very first national census post-Confederation, Confederation being the beginning, our declaration of, well, not independence, but 1867, we said, okay, we want to have a country. And then between 1871, we have regular 10-year intervals. There are some special prairie censuses, 1906, 16, and 26. We're not going to be dealing with them today, but they are available. So let's begin our journey. And I also wanted to mention, all of you are familiar with the fact that the Americans take their census at the top of the decade. And why do we do it at the first year? Because obviously we were a British colony. So we kind of followed the pattern of Britain. Now, it is a turning point in genealogy. It's called the 1851 census, but it was actually January of 1852 when the census was taken, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were taken in 1851. So this is the beginning of this incredible journey through time. Now, in the 1851 census, one of the, it's got your standard name, it's called inmate. I want to make sure that you all know that they were not prisoners. They were just literally, that was the 19th century name, or that name meant someone who was living in a place. And so later on, it took the connotation of an institution. But at that time, an inmate was simply someone who resided somewhere. So this was amazing because we never knew the names of our people. And it's very similar to the 1850 census in the US, in which case we begin to get the names of the women, the girls, the children. This was the same thing. Now, the difference in American versus Canadian, you'll see that there's a column there for religion. And religion is a huge thing because obviously then you know where to look for their records. And so that becomes a very different thing in terms of the Canadian versus American. Now, the next one was just in 1861, and it was really a snapshot just before Confederation. January 14th, Ontario and Quebec took their census. March 30th, Nova Scotia, and August 15th, New Brunswick. 1861, PEI took it at different times. The population was 3.2 million at that point of time. So it really, and you begin to see, like, it wasn't really a country per se. They took their census whenever they wanted to. Now let's have a look at what the 1861 tells us. So The 1861 Canadian census really offers us detailed insight into that mid-century life. It lists everyone in a household by name with the age, the birthplace, religion, and occupation. For those with farming roots, it includes agricultural schedules showing land, crops, and livestock, filling the gap between the early regional counts and the 1871 national census. It captures family just before Confederation and that westward expansion. Really and truly, after Confederation, we begin to see the movement into the West. But at this point, we're like, okay, this is where they saw. And you can also at that time see some of the loyalists that were still there, the families that had escaped America after the Revolution. So it's still early enough. Now, by 1871, this is the first national portrait. April 2nd, 1871, we have a population of 3.6 million. Now, you begin to see that it included the 4 provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. PEI did not join right away. It kind of, waffled, if you will. So that's going to come later. But so realize that if your ancestry is PEI, you're not going to find them on the 1871 census. They may have their own individual, but they're not going to be on the national. Now, in the 1871 census, this sets the tone. In other words, this really begins. This is when we're going to do it. They've decided. It offers a really full picture. You can see here in the list that I've given, you've got the origin. That is something really important because that gives us a clue, begins to get a clue of where these people are from. It tells us married or widowed, going to school, unable to read, unable to write, deaf and dumb, blind and unsound mind. So, and then it lists all the persons in the household. In the 1881 census, now we're beginning to expand. It's April 1881, and the population has now jumped to 4.3 million. And this is when we're going to begin to see that expansion into the West. Manitoba had joined in 1870, even though it was not included in the 1871 census. British Columbia in 1871. And finally, Prince Edward Island said, okay, we're going to come in 1873. And all of them now are part of that national integration. So this is why you might not be able to find some of your peeps, because they, depending on where they moved to and where they were from, you will have to kind of say, okay, where were they in 1875? A lot of times that's going to be an issue. Now, the 1881 census really is a key tool for genealogists, and it offers really detailed format. It includes the full names, the ages, all of that good stuff, but it also obviously captures the early westward migration into Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. And this really, because we lose families. I was just doing a tree just a couple of weeks ago where it was a lot of movement into Manitoba from Quebec. And the 1881 really helped me refine that particular process. This census is really especially valuable for researching those French Canadian, the Irish, the Scottish, the Métis, and the Indigenous roots, as it reflects the growing cultural diversity. It's so well indexed and widely available online. A lot of people turn to this one as their start. If you can't find them in those earlier census, try to find them in the 1881 and then work your way back. Now, in the 1891 census, there's more questions and more clarity. Now, and they took it April 5th, 1891. Everybody took them. 4.8 million people by then. Now, I want to also point out that we are fortunate to have that 1891 picture because, as you all may know, 1890, we've lost it for the US. So if you're lucky enough to have your people actually come to the United States after 1891, at least you have found them on a Canadian census. So that is a very important thing that you can actually begin to go, okay, well, they were here in 1890, and I've had a lot of families move back and forth, but 1891 marks a very pivotal time in that migration. And it was actually the very first time that we were beginning to look at all 7 provinces at the same time. Now, one of the very, very interesting things about this, it continued the movement of what we were looking, but look, it says French Canadians up there, and then it says father's birthplace, mother's birthplace, obviously the religion, the origin, and now we're going to be worrying about employer, and is it a wage earner, unemployed? How many hands employed during the year? And again, the question of able to read and write. That question is very, very important in Canada. And one of the key things about the 1891 is that it was the first one to use punch cards for processing, making it a valuable resource for understanding Canadian families. So it became the first electrically tabulated one. So that became even more accurate. And as always, a lot of you will know that, it's very hard to read census notes because, the enumerators were going fast and furious. And it's the same whether it's America or England or Canada. It gets really tricky, especially if you're dealing in a different language. Now, in the 1901 census, Canada really steps into the 20th century. We took it on March 31st, 1901. The population, almost 6 million. It included the Yukon right in the middle of the gold rush. Some of you may have some people, Americans, who were in the gold rush. You will find them in that 1901 census. Very exciting. Now, the 1901 Canadian census stands out for its exceptional detail. It was the first to include, get this, the exact birth dates. Now, we had that also in the 1900 census in the US, so we were piggybacking off that, I'm sure. And it made it easier to confirm individuals, even when the names vary. Now, I also want to caution you that those dates, they are good, and most of the time they're right, but don't stick to them like glue, because obviously, again, somebody else may have been given that information and may have gotten it wrong. So you want to always trust but verify. And it really begins to show us some major population shifts as families moved into the prairies, into northern Ontario, where a lot of industry was happening, and British Columbia. It's a vital, vital source of early 20th century research. It really kind of blends the 19th century with the 20th century, and this is the meeting point of like families. Maybe they have an older grandmother living with them, that sort of thing. So it's a very important one. Now, the 1911 census is a very refined national portrait. Now we're starting June 1st. Guess what? We decided finally we're going to do them on June 1st. So the population was 7.2 million. And it captured the population just a few years after the creation of Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. So this is huge because now we're like, this is it. The 9 provinces are finally there. And it covered every province and territory in the country that existed. Before I go on, I want to make sure to let you know, obviously Newfoundland would come much, much later in 1949. So this is, for right now, this is Canada, even though Newfoundland did exist and did have, and there are census records that I've seen for Newfoundland as well. So, but for now, it is not included in the Canadian census. Now, in the 1911 Canadian census, improved on the 1901 with a clearer, more concise format. It included, of course, all the full names and the exact birth dates. It continued that. A key addition was the listing of immigration and naturalization, useful for, tracking newcomers. There was a lot, as you can imagine, migration at that time, as in the United States. It records nationality, racial or tribal origin, religion, spoken languages, literacy, and employment status. And it also captured individual income, offering rare insight into the family's finances. And the 1911 census really reflects a time of really major change, showing that immigration, the Western expansion, and the growth of Canada itself. So now we're into 1921 census, the post-war Canada on the record. Again, we're going to take it June 1st. The population now, it's as if we're just watching Canada grow up, 8.7 million. We had come through World War I, very devastating war for Canadians for sure, and the devastating Spanish flu pandemic. and it captures this moment of recovery and transformation. It really is a beginning. It's the obviously the last one before the Great Depression. So we want to see where they're at. It carries many, many key data points from 1911 and also includes the birthplaces of the individual and both parents. And this is obviously very, very important for identifying immigrant roots. New additions to the census provide even more content. It includes nationality, racial or tribal origin, religion. That's not new, but definitely it was one origin wasn't included in the 1911, for example. For working families, it adds details about occupation or trade, whether you were an employee or an employer, clarifying whether someone was self-employed, a wage earner, or working on a commission. It also introduces housing data, such as whether a home was rented or owned and how many rooms it had. So you can get a lot more information about your ancestor. Now, the 1931 census is actually the last one that is available. In Canada, there is a 92-year privacy rule. This particular 1931 census was released to, well, it'll be 2 years in June of 2023. It was very exciting, as you can imagine. And it really was an amazing thing for us because we wait, as we do in America as well, but we're far more we're into 1950 in America. I just found out, my grandparents were finally married. They weren't even married, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But this covered all 9 provinces and the Northwest Territories, though the Yukon was enumerated separately at this time. And it followed the standardized format that we've come to expect at this moment. Now, this is really remarkable because a lot of you will know that obviously we were in the throes of the Depression at this time. So it began really, really focusing in on the total earnings, for example, how long they had, if they were unemployed, all of that. They wanted, obviously, the government wanted to know what was happening. And we begin to see movement back and forth in Canada in terms of the people obviously looking for work, as they were doing in the United States as well. Obviously, we want to know the languages spoken at home. Immigration year was a big, big one. And a key advancement in 1931 was the addition of employment information, whether they were employed, unemployed, or seeking work. All of that is very, very key, and it really bridges the gap. And that's it in terms of how many censuses there are. But the richness of all of these censuses makes it really, really important to be able to delve deep in it, really look at the columns and really understand each one. Now, let's just have a key highlight of all of the different censuses that we've looked at. We've looked at 1851 that included 4 provinces. This was the first full household names, early demographic and agricultural data. 1861, it included PEI at that time. We looked at race, religion, housing, relationship. 1871, we go back to the 4 original provinces, first national census, education and literacy. 1881, we have all 7 provinces and 2 territories. Again, more detail on education and disabilities. 1891, we have all 7 provinces and 2 territories. We have parent birthplaces and employment status, and the French Canadians were identified. 1901, the same coverage. And then we have birth dates, very important. Language spoken, racial origin, and literacy. 1911, same. Now we've added 9 provinces. So this is the addition of Alberta and Saskatchewan. We have an income and schooling and immigration year and home ownership. By 1921, we're really looking at those post-World War I reality. Where were you living? Where were you working? And what language were you speaking? Remember, a lot of migration at that time. And now we have 1931, the very last one, that only included the Northwest Territories. And this really gives us the last bit of news in terms of a census: the Great Depression, unemployment, total earnings, and home details. Now, I'm going to show you a few examples of how, stories, if you will, that really illustrate what you can learn in looking at the census. So this was a family myth revealed. This is my grandma and grandpa. My father is there somewhere. But for many years, I tried to get information from my grandparents about how they met, when they met, etc., etc. They always declined and they didn't want to talk about it. The family myth had been that they had met when grandpa was a boarder at my grandma's house. I had this illusion of a sweet boarder, my grandpa Bob, newly arrived from Scotland, living under the same roof with my great grandfather Clement and his darling daughter Pauline. Not quite. For years, I tried to get them to share. And then finally, I had an issue with the fact that Pauline lived in a town an hour away from where my grandfather was from. So I couldn't figure out like what happened. Then comes the 1931 census. So here I go. Finally, I got the secret out. I just wish my grandparents were, I don't wish they were alive, but because then I could say, no, I found out. But Robert Elvin was indeed a boarder in a tenement, if you will. And he was there. It's him. He's Ecos. It was written in French, Scottish. And down there, right below, in the next apartment across the way, was my grandma. She wasn't living at her house. It wasn't her father. She was living with her sister and her brother-in-law, and she was a mere 17 years old. So when I saw this, I was right away, I'm like, oh my gosh. I even know the tenement that it's still there in my hometown. And I thought, oh wow, this is amazing. And there it is in black and white. I also know that in September of 1932, it was about a year later, they were married. So she was 18. She had to get special permission, and that my dad was born 6 months after that date. Hence the need for secrecy and all of that. And my father at the time said they were always very strange about letting us know. They never wanted to celebrate, they never celebrated their anniversary. And we just thought it was because they were happily married or something. But it was, in fact, they didn't want anyone to do the math. So leave it to their granddaughter to do the math. Now, here's another thing that is very important. I am woman, at least in Quebec. Now, those of you who are going to wander into Quebec land and do not speak French, you can still figure it out, but I'm going to give you some very key things to know. And one of those, this is an actual census from 1851. It lists my 3 times great-grandfather, Celestin is his name, and he was a farmer, and underneath it is a woman named Adelaide Charette. Now, if you didn't know, you would actually think that, who is this person? Well, she was his wife. But they did not use their husband's name. They kept their own maiden names. So if you're looking for Boulanger as a name or any name, a French name, in those early censuses, you're probably not going to find them. So you need to be aware that the name that is listed is her maiden name. And I show you the 1881 census, and then we have Boulanger, Celestin, and then we have Adelaide Charette. She's still at 65 years of age, still using her maiden name. I wanted to also show you that underneath there is my 2 times great-grandfather, Onezem. Don't you just love these French names? And underneath that is my 2 times great-grandmother, and her name is Emilie Guillemette. So even in 1881, they were still using this census. Now, I want to also, we're going to be talking about some other situations. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there is an L in between there. It didn't appear in the 1881, but there's an L. And each one of those children has Joseph L. Boulanger. I'm going to explain that in a minute. Now, in the 1891 census, we have everybody's together. They have given up this ability, if you will, to keep their maiden name. So it really starts, there are still some women who use it in 1891, but it's less and less. What is that D? Some of you are familiar with the D names. The D means also known as, and this began in France. It was a nickname. It was usually used in a military fashion. But when they came over to New France, they began using this name. So remember, you saw an L. Well, because the actual last name was Lefebvre, dit Boulanger, and many of these, also known as, incorporated some part of their personality. So the first one who had taken that was a baker. And you'll find that a lot of times if you just look up that D name, it will tell you something about your family. Le Rivard dit l'Oranger means row. That person actually, I researched this, but he's also one of mine. But he actually it was his nickname because he was so meticulous about how he planted things. Rivard dit la vigne means vine. But the first name is their actual surname. Lesnie dit la liberté means freedom. Audet dit la pointe, the point. And Boissonneau dit Saint-Onge. Saint-Onge, French, it can be a location. Sometimes you'll see like dit Parisien, dit Normand, the sort of thing like that, and it will actually help you identify it. But it's very, very important that you know, sometimes you'll notice that he was still using the L in 1851, so L dot Boulanger, it was still there. And when you're looking for marriage records and that sort of thing, and census records, you'd be surprised. Some of the people would take on the Boulanger name, and some of them would take on the Lefebvre. So you don't know, and this is what Quebec is amazing in terms of its detail, but it gets a little tricky when you start using the D names. Not all of the people had D names, but enough of them had them so that you would be able to get confused. And I was recently doing one in Boise, Idaho, of all places, and there was a last name there. I could not find it, Villeneuve, until I found the original. It's like finding the bookend, and the first name was Amiou. And once I found that, I was able to actually, but they dropped it. In other words, they came to this country, and who wants a big long name like that? So you're going to find in those early census, it may be a different name even. So it's important for you to see the totality of your research to be able to actually access it, you know? This is one of I think it's my 2 times great uncle. And where did Garnet Andrews go? So once I began researching, this is way, way back. I thought his name was really cool, Garnet. And I saw that he died in 1960. I found the obituary, and his wife was named Audrey. But at the beginning, remember this is many, many years. So at the beginning, I find him in the 1891 census. And of course, all of you know how important it is to research each census logically, really find your person. And then we have Garnet, found in the 1901 census. And then we find him as an 11-year-old. And then finally in 1911, he's 21 and he's living with his parents. He's the last one out. But then I couldn't find him for the longest time. When the 1921 census came, I didn't know where he had gone. And who was this Audrey? Finally, I was able to find a marriage record of Garnet, and he marries a Josephine. So I'm like, okay, so let me find. And finally, I realized in 1921, because remember, I actually was there in 2012 when they released the 1921. So I find him in British Columbia. So there we go, that migration that I talked about. So then we have Garnet Andrews, Josephine. They have a son named Garnet, and they have a son named Andrew. So that's great. So now I found him. But what's he doing buried in Danville? So that was the question. It took 10 years until I saw the next census. The next census tells me Garnet is back in Danville in Richmond, Quebec, but he's living with a woman named Audrey. And then he has Andrew and Garnet are both there. And so who's Audrey? Well, it turns out that Josephine had passed away. And because of this, I went back, found the information, and then I tracked down his marriage to Audrey. Now, they actually got married April 29, 1931. So they were just a month married when the census taker came along. They would go on to have 4 children. And I don't know if they went back to British Columbia or not. I'll have to wait till the 1941 census, which will be released in 2033. Okay, that's when we're going to see the next census. Just such a long time to wait. And in the meantime, I do know that those two sons went back to British Columbia and they lived out their lives there. So that is something, but you can see how much information you can glean from one little census. And by doing that record of just tracking it each and every time. Now, here are some genealogical sources that I really recommend. The number one thing I recommend is getting your hands on this book, Counting Canada. Dave Obey, I actually got it way back when, I think it was 2013 or something. Absolutely loved it. I've used it for years and years and years. And I mentioned his website where you can go and order it. He also manages Canadian genealogy.com, obviously ancestry.com, heritage, and Family Search are wonderful. But those of you, again, who are looking for Quebec resources, that I've listed it, I believe, in my handout, Bank QC, and then we have Genealogie Quebec, another, and it's in English and in French. And you do have to pay for the Genealogy Quebec. But if you need to find something, a birth or a marriage or death, it's really a key one to look at. And that's it. Thank you so much. Merci. I look forward. I hope you have some questions for me. I've really enjoyed being able to present this to you.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions for you.
Great.
So the first one says, my 4 times great-grandfather fought for the British in the American Revolution and settled in what is now Grenville County, Ontario.
Oh,
Um,
great.
so they're wondering where they can find the earliest census on him, where he might be recorded.
He fought on in the American
Yes, in the
Revolution,
Revolution.
and then on the loyalist side or as a patriot.
He fought for the British.
He fought for the British, so he would have moved. So the earliest that you would probably find him at, and obviously he might not have been alive. The Loyalist, I didn't put that in, but Loyalist, go to Loyalist Canada. That's an excellent website. Obviously, the earliest census that you would have would be 1851. But again, if someone fought at that, he may not be alive in the 1851. Now, that being said, if he was a landowner, there might be an early one, that you could see in Ontario. There's 1825, 1831, and 1842. Those censuses might have, and he might still be alive. So, but I would actually look, if he fought and he was a loyalist, a confirmed loyalist, they would probably have information on him as well. So you don't want to overlook that. And also make certain that you check out the Genealogical Society and the library in Grenville, in that particular place in Ontario. And they will be able to guide you, because I always say you want to have boots on the ground. You want to be right. If you can't be there, find someone who is there.
Thank you. And then our next question is, for immigrants who were in Ontario in the fall of 1875 and moved on to the US by mid-1877, were any records kept that would identify information about them, such as occupation or housing, since they weren't there for a census?
So they weren't there they may have, what about their port of entry or how they arrived, right? They came, what nationality? Were they English?
I don't believe it says
No.
here. I don't see that.
That would be part of, where did they come in through? And they're in Ontario, and did they come in through, I don't know, like it'd be amazing, like sometimes they come in through America and then they come up north and then they go back down. I mean, following these people is a journey unto itself. And but if they weren't there for the census, and they were just there, it might be church records. You might want to look to see what religion they were, if you know that, and then try to find, I have had success looking at some church records where they weren't on a census, but I found, and sadly enough, it is the children that pass away that give us a lot of information, because that's, they're already married, perhaps they have a child, maybe but then they have a child that passes away, and then that's a burial record. So you want to look at for those kind of things as well.
Thank you. And then we have one more. Do you have any particular print sources that you like to use for um, figuring out the French linguistics and how that works with censuses and other records?
You mean, well, because I'm fluently French, I don't
Mm-hmm.
use them, but, um, I wish I had included this in my talk because I'm preparing another talk where I list, uh, there is a way of being able to identify the French and the English. If you go on Librairie, the Library and Archives Canada, they will give you an English and a French translation of those columns. So you can just they're exactly the same. So you'll be able to actually see them. And they should be fairly easy, but it does make it but no, I don't have any because I don't need it. But that being said, when I'm teaching classes on learning how to translate them, the marriage certificates, it's really a question of looking at the form, and the marriage record is always the same. The baptismal is always the same, and it gives such great detail that's one of the great things about French Canadian genealogy.
Thank you. And
Okay.
it looks like we have one more question. This person's asking, how could I find out whether or not a person was a Canadian citizen?
Wow, that's a great question. First of all, what time frame are we talking about? What years, potentially?
They don't give a particular time frame.
Oh,
Oh, she says
1940. Okay,
1940.
1940. Okay. 1940, let's think about that. 1940, if they were Canadian, how old were they? Did they fight? Because we're talking about World War II, right? So did they fight were they in the Canadian Army, or were they American? Were they in America? They would have had to fill out, if they were living in Canada in 1940, they would have had to actually have some kind of military or a record of some kind, and in the same way that the Americans did it as well. So but again, I don't know how old the person is. It's all relative. I would also want to know why they think that they're from Canada. I wonder. They moved back to the U.S. temporarily and went back to Canada. Oh, from what state? I love this. What state? Iowa. Oh, wow, that's a big one. Okay. Did they go through to like the Midwest, like into Ontario? Is that what you're thinking? It was Ontario? Yes, okay. Um, wow. So 1940 back and forth. Do you have any reason why they would? Like, was it just for work, or was it for um he had a family in Canada? Okay. The only thing I could say is thank goodness for the 1941 census. You will see it. More than likely, they'll be on that 1941 census if they were living there. And they may, if you're lucky, they might, I don't know, were they in the 1940 census? Were they listed in the 1940 census? Yes, okay. So if they went back, and so it will definitely be, and it, like I said, because of the war, because of all the registration that had to be done. There's an excellent comment by someone, Lorraine, I think it is, and she speaks of that, in terms of the registration that had to happen. So absolutely, there's no real, because we don't have census records. You could look at telephone books, the telephone directories, depending on where they settled in Ontario. Again, you're looking for clues, you're looking for their neighbors, you're looking for any kind of information in that, and it can be as easy as looking for in a newspaper. So he probably kept his Canadian citizenship. Okay, okay. All right. So yeah, I would go onto the Library and Archives Canada site and really explore that in terms of confirming it. But again, use the same tools that you would use in any genealogical. You want to find out, you start from the very beginning, Canada, and then you go right to the region and the town. And then if there's newspapers, is there a telephone directory? Are there churches? Things like that. Good luck.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It looks like that'll finish us up. So I just wanted to mention, if anybody has any questions that pop up afterwards, or if you'd like a copy of the chat, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info and we'll get that to you.
Yeah.
So thank you again so
Happy
much,
hunting,
Lisa.
everyone. Happy hunting. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.